Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleespy, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm happy to welcome the people who are joining us in person, as well as all the people who are joining us online. The Massachusetts Historical Society is the first historical society in America. We maintain a research library with an amazing collection of material, which we provide free of charge to researchers from all across the country. Just to highlight a few examples of things in our collection, we have John Winthrop's journal describing the Arbella in harbor about to set sail for the New World. We have the largest collection of Phyllis Wheatley's papers. We have the pen that Abraham Lincoln used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. We have material all the way up to Byron Rushing's papers from his political career that lasted up until just a few years ago. And for the past 232 years, we've been making all of this available to the public. We also host a wide variety of programs, and we hope that you can join us for some of the great stuff that we have planned. We're only able to host programs like this and make them available thanks to the support of our members and donors. I hope that you enjoy the program this evening, and I hope that you'll consider coming to future programs, and I also hope you'll consider becoming a member or supporting MHS through a donation. This evening, we're happy to welcome Dr. Rita Roberts, who is a professor of history and Africana studies and the Nathaniel Wright Stevenson Chair in History and Biography at Scripps College, all the way in California. She teaches courses on the history of early United States, 16th through 21st century African-American history, African diaspora, Black intellectuals and the politics of race, and the modern civil rights movement. She holds a master's degree and PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. This evening, she will be discussing about her book, I Can't Wait to Call You My Wife, African-American Letters of Love and Family in the Civil War Era. This book illuminates the struggles of African-Americans who spent the Civil War trying to hold their families together through letters family members exchanged. Despite harsh laws against literacy and brutal practices of separating families, this work explores how African-Americans found ways to write to each other against all odds. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our author.
Thank you, Gavin. I am so delighted to be here. This is one of my favorite research places, I have to tell you. And I want to thank Olivia, who has been so instrumental in coordinating all of this, and Heather Rockwood. I don't know if I've met Heather yet, but we've met on email, and others who helped put this whole event together. Thank you all. And especially I want to thank my dear friend, Catherine Algor, who is the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, for her support and long-lasting friendship. And it's exciting to visit with you and with Andrew, your significant other, who is a good friend from Scripps. We met there and have retained our friendship. I'm so delighted to be here. So Gavin has told you pretty much what my book is about. I was going to talk about that. So I just want to stress that this book challenges the notion that African Americans had a monolithic experience. It's really important that we know that, because so many Americans have a very slight understanding of African American experience. Doesn't matter their ethnicity or color, just a very poor understanding. And certainly if they do know anything, it's very one-dimensional. And so I challenge that notion that African American experience was one-dimensional. It is multidimensional. It depended upon where one lived. It depended upon whether one was free or enslaved, whether one was enslaved on a large plantation or in an urban area, or in Louisiana or in the Upper South. So much depended upon where one lived in terms of what their experience was. And of course, whether one was enslaved or free. So the experience is not monolithic, and I try to stress that in the book. And what I do try to also make sure is that everyone who is mentioned in this book, that African Americans demonstrate, a large number of them demonstrate their determination to live their lives with purpose and with dignity as far as was possible, even in oppressive circumstances. And so I wanted to make sure that this book would tell their story in their own words. I really think that that's important. So I wrote the book. People ask me all the time, well, why did you write this book? Because I have been doing other things. I tend to focus on free Blacks mostly. And I'm writing this big, huge project of free Blacks in the South, in the Upper South mainly, but I'm sort of using one family and trying to tell the whole story of free Blacks from the mid-17th century, which is very rare to know that there were free Blacks in the mid-17th century, Virginia, of course, and try to trace their lives all the way to the late 19th century, and just to see how they navigate the racial terrain, but more than that, to see how they lived their lives, how they managed to do that. And I'm depending upon, you're probably wondering what my sources would be, property records, because these individuals were not sure were they actually slaves or not, but they were treated like indentured servants. They were given land, actually, when they finished their service after 7 years, some 10, depending upon the stipulations in the contract. So I'm trying to sort of trace that, and it's not easy. It's taking me a long time. So I was working on that, and I've been working on that. But in the meantime, I've been asked so many times to give a talk, quote, African-American history to all kinds of organizations. For example, the National Colored Women's Association, National Color, invited me to speak at their regional talk, San Gabriel, California, and talk about African-American history. Well, it's a big topic. How do you do that? So I started narrowing down on sort of how do you tell people a little bit, give them information, fill in some gaps of their knowledge of history, and not be too teachy, not to be too didactic. So how do you do that to a general audience? An audience, often professional people, but still without knowledge of history. And so I thought, I'll do what I do with my students. I'll read documents, or I'll pass them out and have them read them. So I started doing that. And Catherine, as a historian, knows that's one of our devices to get students thinking and talking. And so I did the same thing, devices to get students thinking and talking. And so I did the same thing. And so I started using letters. And I continue to be invited to organizations all over California. And so I just thought, okay, I'm going to write a book. I'm just going to get this book out because I keep sort of writing this book in my head. So I'll just do that. So I decided to write a book. And I was going to rely mainly on letters, which is what I've managed to do, and tell the story of African-American experience. And I chose the Civil War era because the Civil War intrigues me. It's a fascinating period in American history. And you all know that we're still fighting the war in some ways, right? The war is very much with us. So I'm mainly a 19th century historian, so it made sense that I would focus on the Civil War. And naively, I thought it would be a really quick research project. 5 years. I'll do this in 5 years, then I'll get back to my real work, right? I'll get back to that, and I can continue to do the other as well. All I needed to do was synthesize my own work, synthesize the work of my colleagues, and voila, there would be a book. Well, I found that it's not easy to find a commercial press. I wanted a commercial press because I wanted to be able to use images that university presses tend not to have the money for or the interest in. And I wanted images. And if you know anything about this book, if you've read the book at all, you've seen there are lots of photographs. I found a press that wanted 75 demanded that they have 75 photographs. I said, wow, this is the press for me. But it wasn't easy finding this press. First, I found out, and I should have known this, Andrew, you could have told me this. You need an agent. You just can't write to a commercial press and think that they're going to talk to you. Who are you? You may be an academic, but So I started looking for an agent, and I sent my manuscript. They said, yeah, let me read. And too scholarly, too much, all those footnotes, this is not my goal. So I decided, okay, I'm going to figure out what I can do to make an agent really find my book appealing. I had already started doing the research. 2012, a good friend of mine told me, you need to go to the Massachusetts Historical Society and read John Washington's letters. I was here, summer of 2012. I already knew my title. After reading John Washington's letters, John writes in his letter to Annie Gordon, his fiance, I can't wait to call you my wife. I can't wait to call you my wife. She's writing to him, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. And he's trying to defend himself. He's sort of letting her know, I really do love you, right? So 2012, I started this project. And at the same time, I was teaching, mostly full-time, coordinating a program, Mel May's undergraduate fellowship, started it, coordinated it. So 10 years later, 2 years with COVID, archives are all closed, including yours, I'm sure. Most of the archives were closed for 2 years. So I had collected quite a few letters. Many of them were published, some from archives, some already digitized. And all of this just took much longer than just being totally unrealistic. So originally I had 500 pages or more. I had 6 chapters. And I think, the agents just thought, this is just way too much. I wrote very clearly, I want this to appeal to the general public. And I think they thought, she's on another planet somewhere. So I kept sending it out. Took a long time, but I found a perfect agent, so supportive. She called me up during COVID and said, I hope you haven't signed with anyone. And I said, oh, no, no one's. And she said, I love your book. And so we talked, and she decided to represent me. And then I think it was around May 2020 or 2021. COVID has sort of fuzzed my mind. I don't know about yours, but right, I can't remember exactly when things happened. I contacted my agent and I said, I'm going to cut this book in half. She was shocked. And I wasn't sure, well, maybe I shouldn't do this. Her response was one of, disbelief. And she said, are you sure? And I said, well, I think it's too diffuse. I think I really need to narrow down. I had public and then I had private letters. So 2 chapters each of public and private, six altogether, divided in antebellum, Civil War, and then post-Civil War. And then I thought, let me just make it more focused on the private letters and focus on family. And that's what I did. And got a publisher really quickly. So obviously I was on the right track. So the title again was one that I had always known was going to be important, because I have to tell you, I was sitting in the Massachusetts Historical Society archival library. Where is it? Downstairs? Yeah. Okay. I haven't been here for a while. And I was reading these letters, and I looked up and I just wanted to shout. And those of you who have actually studied in an archival library know that no one is interested in your work. They could care less if you found your title. They don't want to hear it. They've got their own project. And I was just looking around thinking, my title, I've got my, but no one cared. But anyway, so when John Washington says, I can't wait to call you my wife, this title resonates so much with enslaved African-American experience. And most African-Americans were enslaved, 4 million in 1860. The vast majority were enslaved. So we need to understand what slavery is. Slavery essentially means one human being or an institution, a school, a university, a church, owns another human being or several human beings. So the human beings, it means, are commodities. They can be bought, sold, auctioned, traded, passed down in wills, inherited. And the American legal system ensured that slaves were more property than human in law. So the American legal system not only ensured that enslaved individuals were more property, they ensured that enslaved individuals were kinless. Kinlessness and racial slavery defines the American slave system. Enslaved individuals had no formal power over themselves, their children, their wives, husbands. They could not direct at all what was happening to their own children, babies, teenagers. The slaveholder had complete control. So they couldn't protect their children. They couldn't provide for the welfare of their children. And slave codes in every state forbid the legitimization of marital bonds. So we need to understand that. So this meant that slaves could be sold, traded, and so on. You're not breaking a contract if you can do so. So it wouldn't interfere with the profits of slave owners. So when John Washington says, perhaps unwittingly, I can't wait to call you my wife, unwittingly, he might be challenging, he definitely is challenging the system that denies the legitimization of family. And in this way, he reflects, many other ways he does not, but in this way, he reflects the experience of most enslaved people. So the letters show that African Americans in slavery consistently rejected the fundamental nature of the slave system, that they were more commodity than human. And they did this in so many ways. And in establishing family was one of the primary ways. They refused to allow a system to deny them a basic universal expression of humanity, which is forming family, engaged in courting, forming communities. They did so without legal sanction. So they challenged this notion that they were more property than human. This is a primary form of resistance that enslaved people engaged in throughout the entire period of enslavement. And so the evidence is definitely in the correspondence. It's there writ large. And they show that African Americans, as far as possible, engaged in monogamous relationships. They assumed that their relationship would be permanent as far as possible, although the threat of sale held over the heads of every enslaved person, child, and adult. They were aware of the precariousness of their relationship, but at the same time, they persisted in these relationships because, again, this is part of the expression of who they were as human beings. So just a few examples I will show you and then leave it up to you to ask me questions. We see in this exchange between Adam and Emily Plummer. You haven't been looking at the book. Let's go back to the book just once. Don't you love that? I love that cover. I fell in love with that cover. Okay. So Adam and Emily Plummer are an amazing couple. They write back and forth to one another, excuse me. They are on two different plantations, and slaveholders tended to like their slaves on different plantations. And Adam knows how to read barely and write barely. Emily is illiterate. And at first, her slaveholder is writing for her. And then she has a good friend, a seamstress, a white woman, who writes for her. And then at the end, it looks like she's actually writing for herself. It's fascinating just to read. And there are many more letters. I just included a few just for a glimpse of African-American life in slavery. And so Emily is moved and then moved again and then moved again. Adam is in a rather stable slaveholding family. He's with the Calvert family in Maryland, and that's pretty stable, lots of money. And your fear is that the slaveholder is going to lose money or move to Mississippi, separate family, or any number of things can happen. Die was one of the main reasons that enslaved people were always, wondering what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to my children, and to my spouse. And so Emily is moved, and then she's moved again, and they're exchanging letters. So evidently Adam had written to her. I don't have this letter, but Adam must have written to her and said something about he was in despair, that he just didn't know if they could go on. Emily, April 20, 1856, writes back, "I want you to tell me why you wrote me so troubled a letter. I was very sorry to hear that you should say that you and I are parted for life, and I am very troubled of it." And she had good reason, because many times enslaved people were aware that their slaveholder would want them to marry someone else, in terms of producing more children. And so she's kind of not sure what's happening. And then she signs it. Again, the formality of 19th century letter writing is so precious. Your affectionate wife. She's saying all these things. Your affectionate wife, Emily Plummer. So Adam writes back, and you have to read through the lines. This is just an excerpt. He's basically telling her, "I didn't intend for you to be upset." He said, "The same day in the morning that I was thinking about you in my heart, a few minutes, a little boy came and brought your letter." And he said, "I received it with open hands and joyful heart, and you are mistaken that I do not wish to be with you and the children." And their letters are like this throughout. They are constantly keeping abreast of what's going on. Emily has most of the children. Two of the children are separated. One of the older one is the oldest child is sent various places, but not too far. And the younger child is left behind when Emily is forced to move. Eventually, they move. Emily and her children move so far away that Adam's slaveholder allows him to catch a train, the B&O, and then he travels and by foot walks to see miles and miles to see his wife and children. If family wasn't central, then I do not understand the English language, right? So Harriet Newby is another example. Dangerfield Newby, can we keep the image on not on me, but on the slides? Dangerfield Newby was owned by his white slaveholding father, and he was the child of the concubine, they're called. Oh, sorry. He was he is the child of the concubine, or we won't say slave mistress, because the mistress was usually the wife, the white wife. And Dangerfield Newby's father decided that they would all move to Ohio in the 1840s and 50s. Dangerfield was an adult. He had a wife and he had children. They had all been slaves. The wife, of course, was not owned by Dangerfield Newby's slaveholder. And so Harriet is left with the children. Dangerfield is determined that he is going to raise the money by hook or crook, working as hard as he can. He's in Ohio, he's free. He's hoping that he can raise the money. He gets about $750, but it's not enough, not even to pay for his wife, let alone the children. So she is writing to him all the time, telling him, I thought I never should see you on this earth, no charms for me. And she keeps telling him, you have to come get me. And she's letting him know that possibly she's going to be sold and the children and separated. He becomes so desperate, he joins John Brown's raid. And 1859 in the fall, and Harriet's letters are found on him. He's so desperate, he thinks he can, I guess John Brown convinces him that he's going to end slavery. I think John Brown really thought, somebody's writing a really good book on John Brown right now, Walter Johnson at Harvard. And I'm really looking forward to learning, there's this sort of argument, is he kind of mentally unstable? What's going on with John Brown? I think John Brown really thought that at least this would be a catalyst to war. I think he was right in that regard. We'll find out what Walter has to say. So Harriet's letters are found on Dangerfield's body. He is shot by the Virginia militia. Family was central, and it's evident between children and their parents. And we have 10-year-old Annie, who writes to her dad. This is the only image we have of Annie. She writes to her dad. Her dad has escaped to England because he is sought by the state of Virginia, and the federal government, actually. He is considered a suspect in conspiring to bring about the John Brown raid. He told John Brown it was an insane thing to do, don't do it, and that John Brown did not have an understanding of how slavery was protected in Virginia and the rest of the South. But John Brown went ahead anyway. And so Frederick Douglass escapes to Great Britain. So Annie writes to her dad, just to lighten things up a little bit. She says to her father, she knows that he is proud of her, and she brags about her ability to read German. So I'll just read a little bit. She says, my dear father, this is Rochester, December 7th, 1859. I'm proceeding in my German very well, for my teacher says so. I am in the first reader and I can read. I expect that you will have a German letter from me in a very short time. I have learned another piece, and it is about slavery. I'm going to speak it in my school. My piece is this. This is not the man for me who buys or sells a slave, for he who will not set him free, but send him to his grave. But he whose noble heart beats warm for all men's life and liberty, who loves alike each human form, that's the man for me. So she tells him it's in the Garland of Freedom, 4 verses of it. And then she says, poor Mr. Brown is dead. That hard-hearted man said he must die, and they took him in an open field and about a half a mile from the jail hung him. And then she adds, the German children like me very much, but I have gone ahead of them, and they have been there longer than me too. They all send their love, talking about the family, from your affectionate daughter, Annie Douglass. So 10-year-old Annie, like others, showed a different type of exhibition of familial love. Annie is quite positive that her dad cares about her, even as she brags about learning German. So in contrast, fugitive slave Germaine Logan receives a letter from his former slaveholder. And she has no idea that she's writing on the eve of war. So she's writing, her name is Sarah Logue, and she's writing from Tennessee, February 20th, 1860, right on the eve of the Civil War. To harm, I now take my pen in hand to write you a few lines to let you know how we all are. I am a cripple and I am still able to get about. I write you these lines to let you know the situation we are in, partly in consequence of your running away and stealing old Rock, our fine mare. Though we got the mare back, she never was worth much after you took her. And as I now stand in need of some funds, I'm determined to sell you. And I have had an offer for you, but did not see fit to take it. If you will send me $1,000 and pay for the old mare, I will give up all claim to you, all claim I have to you. Write to me as soon as you get these lines and let me know if you will accept my proposition. In consequence of your running away, we had to sell Abe and Ann and 12 acres of land. And I want you to send me the money that I may be able to redeem the land that you was the cause of our selling, and on receipt of the above named sum of money, I will send your bill of sale. By this time, Germaine Logan has gone to school in New York, fled to Canada for a while, came back to New York, has a huge congregation in Syracuse, New York, and is quite a prominent abolitionist. He and Frederick Douglass are very good friends. Incredibly well-read, and as you will see, eloquent. I'm reading just excerpts. The letters are much longer. Syracuse, New York, March 28th, 1860. He is now a minister of Presbyterian Church, I believe. Mrs. Sarah Logue, yours of the 20th of February is duly received. You are a woman, but had you a woman's heart, you could never have insulted a brother by telling him you sold his only remaining brother and sister because he put himself beyond your power to convert him into money. You sold my brother and sister, Abe and Ann, and 12 acres of land, you say, because I ran away? Now you have the unutterable meanness to ask me to return and be your miserable chattel, or in lieu of thereof, send you 1,000 to enable you to redeem the land, but not redeem my poor brother and sister. And he goes on and on like this. It's a very strong letter. He doesn't fool around. He lets her know that she doesn't respect African-American family. That's basically what he's telling her. And then when the war came, the evidence of the centrality of family in African-American life is really overwhelming, not just among enslaved people, but also free as well. Enslaved people take advantage in the disruption of the war, and they go looking for their family members. In fact, Union captains, Union officers had a hard time understanding why the soldiers were disappearing. Black soldiers, when they became involved in the war in 1863, they were going to look for their family. They were trying to save their family members. And so they are searching for family members from refugee camp to refugee camp, wherever the Union lines were. And like couples everywhere, Black couples engaged in courtship and marriage during the war. It's the beginning of the war when John Washington declares his love for Annie. John Washington escapes, crosses the river. Union soldiers tell him to come on. He and his cousin escape. And he becomes, at first, an assistant to a Union soldier officer. And it's an exciting story. I tell about it in the prologue, and kind of fun to tell. The letter includes that line that says, basically, I really want you to be my wife. Annie has found out that John is going to parties. Not a good idea. They are supposed to be engaged. And evidently she's chastising him for it, criticizing him for it. And he writes to her and says, I really want you to be my wife. I really, you're the only one, is basically what he's saying. And he writes like this in several letters. It's a wonderful letter, wonderful communication between the two. And they do end up getting married actually during the war. And then there's Sergeant Major Lewis Douglass, who writes to Amelia Logan, Germaine Logan's daughter. And their love letters, I have to tell you, are beautiful, just absolutely beautiful. They're from a prominent abolitionist family, both of them. And they write so eloquently that you just want to keep reading more and more. And at first, they're just courting. And then soon they are actually becoming very much involved. And during the war, even more so. So during the war, he writes to her, and she's not sure if he is as committed or she kind of toys with him. And he lets her know that he loves her very much. And he essentially says to her, I want to marry you. He's a soldier in the war. I want to marry you simply because I love you. And as my love for you has stood the test of nearly 2 years, and those years spent in absence from you, and a portion of time not even having the pleasure of a letter from you, I base the hope on such foundation that my love and your love remain undying. And in this particular slide I'm showing is she is worried about him getting killed in action. And he is actually, he fights with the 54th Regiment, and he is actually hurt very much, so much so that they cannot have children. And, but he writes to her and he lets her know, he says, I shall always love you, never give me up for dead until you are certain of it. My fear is that I may be reported dead, and this happened a lot. When I am not, it is often the case in battle. And so he says, I love you, and so on. So beautiful letter. And I follow the Douglass family from the antebellum period through the Civil War, and then after the Civil War. In 1869, Amelia and Lewis Douglass married, and they are written up in all of the major important newspapers and told about this lovely wedding. And that's the way the book ends. Thank you. Questions?
How did you find the letters and the pictures and the thought of the Civil War time? It sort of reminds me of the Ken Burns, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And so it was more, for what, but the thought of them, and that was a beautiful, beautiful picture of them. Attractive couple.
Yes,
Lovely,
very
especially
much.
the last one. I'm proud. I'm beaming. I'm beaming.
How did I find the letters in places like this? Massachusetts Historical Society had the John Washington letters. No longer, they are now in Virginia, in a Virginia archive, but there are many other letters and works to be had here. A Library of Congress, the National Archives, some are digitized. Some of the Library of Congress letters are digitized between Frederick Douglass and his children. So everywhere. I went to one private archive, David Blight, who's a well-known historian and wrote a masterful work on Frederick Douglass, told me about Walter Evans. Walter Evans had a collection of letters of the Douglasses, had a scrapbook, and Amelia and Lewis's letters. And I sat there and read them on his dining room table in Savannah, Georgia. went from California there and sat there for a week going through his material. They're now at Yale. His materials are at Yale. Walter Evans archival materials at Yale. So they're everywhere. And so, there are a lot of letters. I could have added more, and I still would like to do that. There are a lot more letters, but I didn't want to make the book overwhelming. So I wanted to give examples of diverse experiences, and I think I've achieved that.
Hi. So I am fascinated by that woman who wrote the letter to Germaine. Was it Germaine?
Sarah Logue.
How did she find him? I mean, if he ran away, how was she able to get the letter to him?
He wasn't really in hiding anymore. He had a big church. He was writing for abolitionist papers. He was quite bold, like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is eventually someone buys him so that he doesn't have to worry about constantly on the run. But Germaine Logan was sort of saying, I dare you to come after me. And in this letter, he says, I have many people who would come up and protect me from people like you. So,
do you know if Reverend Logan was ever able to find his brother and sister who had been sold?
No, I don't know that. It's a really interesting story because it seems that his mother was actually free and was kidnapped. And that did happen. So the children should have all been free. Yeah.
There's also a question online about, I think it was
thank you.
Dangerfield, his family, if you know the fate of his wife. And
I'm sorry?
children.
Who's?
Dangerfield, I think.
Dangerfield Newby? What about his wife?
If you know the fate of the rest of his family after he was in the John Brown raid.
No, I don't.
Could you say something about how the Civil War brought freedom, but also it created this enormous number of refugees and disruption to people's family lives? That part of your story?
Yes. So this is a war like no other war. Because enslaved people were not going to sit around and wait to be rescued. Whenever Union lines were nearby, they snuck away to the Union lines. Now, imagine if you are a general in an army and you're trying to conduct a war and you've got all these people with little children, older people coming along, following you. It's disruptive. So they started creating camps. They called them contraband camps because Jonathan Butler called them that for practical reasons, but I call them refugee camps. And they were. And because they were not property, and I want to stress that. And so those who were men were put to work and eventually were part of the Union Army after 1863. And the women were also often put to work, helping feed, worked as cooks, as nurses, and so on. The aged were hard to care for. So it was a problem. It was difficult. But what happens is that Northerners go down, Northern teachers, Black and white, mostly white teachers go down and start teaching all of these women, mostly women, older men, how to read and write. And they are overwhelmed by the number who want to learn how to read and write. They shouldn't have been surprised. It's a literate society. Most whites know how to read and write, at least in the North by that time. The degree of abilities are varied, but we don't know for sure how much. It's very hard to get numbers in the mid-19th century on literacy. But the enslaved population basically were denied access to learning, gaining literacy. But we now know that about 5 to 10% actually did know how to read and write. And if one person knows how to read and write in a group, they can share with others what's going on. And that's what happens. And so these refugee camps became schools.
Dr. Roberts, so this book's been out for a little while.
Since October.
Yes, and you've gotten some lovely notice, may I say, about it, and you've presented a few places.
Yes.
And I wonder what people's reaction has been to your overall theme about what you're really talking about is the basic humanity of these people. And do you have any stories that you could share or about audience's reaction to this?
Well, it's really interesting because I've been talking to the general public, and I was in a kind of posh town club in Pasadena, and one lovely woman was telling me how much she enjoyed the book, but she thought it was going to be just a bunch of love letters. It's just going to be love, just a easy book to read. And she said, and it was a history book. And I liked it. And I, of course, said, oh, I'm so glad. So that's one. But I found that letters, just whether I talk to general audiences or my students, just enthralled those who are listening. I used to have students literally reading some things and they cried. There's this letter between Laura Spicer and her husband. And we know that we have his letters, we don't have her letters, but we can intuit what he is saying. And let me just read a bit of it for you because it's so eloquent, I can't improve on him. They had been parted for over 20 years. And they thought that they were both dead. They thought each other was dead. And then they find out after the Civil War that they are not. And this is when I cry and my students cry. And so he writes back to her and he says, I read your letters over and over again. I keep them always in my pocket. If you are married, I don't ever want to see you again. I would much rather, then he knows she's not. I would much rather you get married to some good man, for every time I get a letter from you, it tears me all to pieces. And he says, the reason I haven't written to you in a long time is because the letters disturb me so much. You know, I love my children. They have 3 children together. And I would come and see you, but I know you could not bear it. I want to see you and I don't want to see you. I love you just as well as I did the last day I saw you, and it will not do for you and I to meet. I'm married and my wife and I have 2 children. And if you and I meet, it would make for a very dissatisfied family. But he keeps writing to her. Now imagine her heart is torn. It's heart-wrenching. So they decide they're not going to meet again, but then he writes to her again. And he says, send me some of the children's hair in a separate paper with their names on the paper. Will you please get married as long as I am married? My dear, you know the Lord know both of our hearts. You know it never was our wishes to be separated from each other, and it never was our fault. Oh, I can see you so plain at any time. I'd rather anything to have happened to me most than ever have been parted from you and the children. As I am, I do not know which I love best, you or Anna. If I was to die today or tomorrow, I do not think I would die satisfied till you tell me you will try and marry some good, smart man that will take good care of you and the children, and do it because you love me, not because I think more of the wife I have got than I do of you. And it goes on. Yeah. It's heartbreaking, hard to read. And this is the post-Civil War period. These are happenings we don't usually read about. And we don't think about the fact that people found each other in refugee camps, thinking the other was dead. We have stories, Freedmen's Bureau kept records of those who came through different refugee camps of a mother who was barefoot walking around. This is April 1865, looking for her, maybe later, looking for her baby. And after interviewing her, they discovered this baby was no longer a baby, had to have been over 20 years. And she would say, has anyone seen my precious baby? Going from camp to camp. And they couldn't get her to stay, to take care of her, to get shoes for her. She was determined to find her precious baby. This is a part of an American story that we all need to know as well. Thank you.
So I would just say that we have books available for sale in the lobby. And for those of us joining online, I hope they will consider purchasing a book from their favorite online retailer.